let's talk about the Incarnation. The Incarnation in Christianity is the divinity, the simultaneous divinity and humanity of Christ. And the specific way in which we are to understand this was something that did not crystallize for some time in Christianity's history. And what we see consistently in the history of really, this is religion in general when we're talking about the crystallization of dogma in this way. But outside pressures came to influence the concrete formulation of specific pieces of doctrine that were previously perhaps not even necessary. It was not necessary to make things that explicit. Nobody was arguing about it or causing a particular problem, perhaps. And so there was not the pressure to formulate, let's say, the creeds as we see, especially later in Christianity's history, later in the early part of Christianity's history. So the various heresies are going to influence how it is that we interpret certain things, how it is that ultimately the church is going to come down and say, we have to do it in this particular way. And a lot of these disputes are going to be settled relatively early on in Christianity's history. And indeed, the Eastern Orthodox Church is going to say that all of the major disputes were really settled by the 700s. And after this time, these other things that the church believes, the Western Church believes that it needs to pronounce on, especially in terms of things like papal infallibility, and this is something that Smith describes it at some length. This is not present in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the reason for this is fairly simple. It's not necessary. So in the West, and in general for Christianity and for religions, and this is a point that Smith argues, so that you don't have all kinds of, random practices and infighting and heterodoxy, let's say heterogeneous practices and beliefs, so that you do have a single religion instead of, something that's almost unrecognizably splintered. He says that you're going to have some kind of, constellation in terms of dogma and doctrine. And whether or not this is the case is not entirely clear because, of course, when we think about a religion that has many, many, many different ways of practice and factions and, lines of thought and belief and practice and that sort of thing, Hinduism certainly comes to mind. And that doesn't seem to cause a significant problem there. So I think he would have to make an additional step in his argument and say that there's something specific to Christianity that makes it to where it needs to do this, that it's really necessary for them to do this. And it might be the claim to exclusivism. In other words, the claim to have the truth, and that no one else has the truth. And if that's going to be maintained, then perhaps he's right that you must have then one truth, that you can't have many. So the argument might still be tenable given that particular proviso, but nevertheless. Okay, so the Incarnation. Now, the Incarnation is something very interesting in religious history because it represents a change in the way that the divine is thought of in relation to man, and what man is changes. Now, this is at the same time that we start seeing a more inward turn generally with Greek and Roman culture. And this is evidenced clearly by Stoicism. So if you read some of the accounts of the dynamics of the history of the will, let's say, so the concept of the will, and of course, by extension, the self, this is something that changes a great deal during this time. And so for the Stoics, for instance, by the time of Epictetus, we hear that the prohairesis, the will, faculty of choice, is something that cannot be taken away from one, that this is sort of the sine qua non of the individual, and that the individual should persist always and throughout a variety of psychological experiences and whatever it is that you might be thinking, feeling, or doing. This seems perhaps perfectly obvious to us, but it's certainly not perfectly obvious in religious and philosophical history. And it's something that even in Plato's time, we don't have in the same way. With regard to the Incarnation, we're talking about the meeting place of the divine and human. And in other words, Christ, what's unusual about the conception of Christ as being both fully man and fully God is the idea that we could have the human and divine intermixed in this way. This was, in early centuries, one of the principal problems with the reception of Christianity was the thought that, a man can't be God. A God, the gods represent that which is eternal, not this kind of mutable, destructible, frail stuff that we're accustomed to encountering in the world and of which we consist. And so there was the thought that, a man can't be God because man is contingent and man lives in the ephemeral world, whereas the realm of the gods is the realm of the eternal. And this is an objection that might surprise us today because we're not accustomed to thinking in this way, and we're not also as well oriented toward the way that the ancients thought of this. But in fact, this was one of the problems. Now, one of the things that this draws attention to is what Smith has in mind in calling the Incarnation a contradiction. Now, he, I think, could have been more careful with the way that this was dealt with, and perhaps this is appropriate. As you know, my principal area of research is with Meister Eckhart. And for him, of course, this is one of the central ideas. So that I think that Smith could have dealt with this particular topic in more sensitivity is probably not all that surprising. But at the same time, he is a little uncautious in saying that the Incarnation is a contradiction, and that it is something that is perhaps even a problem because it's a contradiction. Because although this has been regarded by a great many people, and in Christian history, this has caused a number of problems, including a number of well-known heresies for the early church that the early church had to deal with and had to eventually come down on one side and say, no, Christ is fully God and fully man. And I'm thinking of, Arianism and Docetism and that sort of thing. But that this is a contradiction as if it were in need of resolving, I think is perhaps the interesting implication that we should deal with. And we'll have occasion to touch on this as we move forward in Christian history as well. Because fundamentally, the church came down on the side of affirming that Christ was completely man and completely God. And this does seem to be a contradiction. It is the very least mysterious and something that must be thought through. It must be contemplated. It's not something that offers itself immediately to the understanding and is very plain and clear. So I think at least we can say that of the Incarnation. And it's an idea that we must think about and that we must try and come to understand. So someone like Eckhart later in Christian history is going to insist upon the contradiction and not try and resolve it in a specific fashion. In other words, is going to insist upon it being a contradiction and is going to insist upon the logical impossibility of certain aspects therein, and to try and, have us think differently, to try and shake us loose from the way that we're accustomed to thinking about these things. Because the very reason that we think that this implies a contradiction, according to someone like Eckhart and mystics of his ilk, that's part of what holds us back from understanding more about God. And so when Smith calls it a contradiction, I want to say it would be nice if he were a bit more sensitive to that aspect of Christian history. Now, along similar lines, he says that the idea that Christ would be God and that someone could be divine was startling at that time, just as it is in ours, he says, but also that the idea that, emperors could be worshipped as gods or could become gods was commonplace. And so the cry would have been, well, okay, what else is new? Okay, so Christ is God. Well, maybe. Maybe. I don't think it was quite that simple. And especially in Jewish circles, I think this would have been a more startling idea. And it's hard for us to get our minds around how revolutionary some of these ideas were, since we are now so much saturated with them, so used to hearing about them. So that's something to keep in mind as well, is how would this have been received by people who were not Christian at the time? In the immediate wake of Christ's teaching, how would this have been understood? How would it have been understood in Jewish culture in particular, and Roman culture more broadly? So again, these are things to think about there. Now, Smith also cites a dictum that came to be used a great deal in the history of Christian mysticism, and that is Irenaeus's statement that God became man so that man might become God. Now, he glosses over this without saying very much about it, but this is a clear injunction to mysticism and certainly points in the direction of a different understanding, not only of Christ and the incarnation, but of people generally. And so there is the idea that you could have the deification of any particular person or people in general is a different idea than the incarnation, potentially at least. And it is contentious in a way that I wish he would have talked more about. But nevertheless, that is an important statement in Christian history. He's right to mention it, but he doesn't go into too much detail as to why it's significant. And again, the significance is for its relation specifically to the mystical side of Christianity in the sense of trying to come to an understanding of the corpus of believers as divine, individuals as divine, and so on. Now, this is something that Christianity carries in the form of the idea of the image of God, that man was made in the image of God, is something that's explored by mystics of all stripes and theologians more broadly as bridging the relation, as establishing a relation between man and God, and perhaps indeed defining a relation between man and God and calling out something unique about what it means to be human, if in fact humans are made in the image of God and other animals are not. So that's also going to be very significant in Christian history, and the way in which that particular idea is interpreted as well is going to weigh heavily in terms of a lot of the changes that we see throughout Christian history.